Okay, welcome back. I am working right now in Illustrator here, making the shape of this knife. I already made it and I was just playing around with stretching it out a little bit. I bring it into the Tormach software. This is the Tormach design software. It then creates a cut path for the 4400 Torchmate CNC plasma table. And I bring it into their software which runs the machine. I load the job and it gives me my coordinates where my XY is, and I just jump right into cutting it. And I think I was filming on my iPhone. And there you see, I just set the table up again after being in the storage for a very long time, so that's why there was no water in it. There was water in it about an hour later. You can make one or two cuts, but it's not a good idea. You'll end up burning through the bottom. And now this is my new Ameribraid grinder setup. I have four of them now, and I bought so many for the class. And they made me a special deal. They gave me a discount, but I didn't get them for totally free. But they did give me a really good value. They gave me all the extra wheels and stuff. That's 1084 steel, and Steve Pellegrino was guiding me through this build, suggesting what I do, how I do it, when I do it. He said now's the time before we harden it. Even heat ovens, one love to even heat. They gave me this oven so that I could promote it for them. So thank you guys. And this thing is really nice. It's got the computer control. And I learned something with Steve. Once that knife is hot and once it's fully submerged, you will not get a flash. If you hold it partially in the hardening fluid, I guess that's called Parks 50. That's what that is. If you hold it partially in, you might get a flash, which is the dangerous fire flashover. So we're hardened and tempered. I didn't show the tempering because it's really nothing except looking at an oven. And hardened and tempered, and now we're doing the final grind, and we're just trying to keep it cold. We don't want to let it get over hot because then we'll lose that temper and that heat treat. And just working on it. Learn from Steve to use the abrasive belts, the Scotch-Brite belts. There's two grades of Scotch-Brite. There's this brown one and then a blue one. And Steve was teaching everybody how to use the stones, the water stones, to sharpen. And he can get a really nice edge. My knife ended up being a little bit thick compared to something like Steve would do. He gets this like perfect, like 1 degree bevel from the cut edge to the back edge. It's crazy. Mine always tend to be a little bit fat halfway through the middle, and then towards the blade they get sharp. So mine don't hold that sort of razor sharp edge as much as Steve's, but I'm learning. Now I'm using the new epoxy from Total Boat. And I have this piece of wood. You can see there's some voids in it. I didn't really have footage of me showing it slowly. There it is right there. You see that void, and it kind of went all the way through. So I knew if I did any cutting to that, the piece would begin to fall apart. So I had to put epoxy in it. And here you see me putting the epoxy in it. I was going to build a little box, and then it occurred to me, I just want to get some epoxy in the cracks. It doesn't matter. So it occurred to me to just put it in a little Ziploc bag. I keep all different sizes of these Ziplocs. I get them from Uline, and I use them for everything. And again, I just wanted to keep the epoxy squished against the wood, so I just cut two little pieces of scrap and used electrical tape to keep them side by side, put it in the pressure tank. Now this eliminates any air bubbles. It just pressurizes. All the air will go into one bubble inside the bag, not necessarily in the wood. And it worked fine. It worked really well. And my only regret is that you didn't see more of the epoxy in the finished piece. The inside, once I cut it open to make either side of the scales, that looked better than the outside as far as like making some cool thing. So there's me just being silly. I sand the flat. I just give myself some flat reference somewhere in there. I was never really good at making handles. I always kind of avoid the obvious steps and try and come up with something stupid and silly. And this time I just wanted to take a traditional swing at it because I was learning from Steve, and he does a lot of traditional knife handles, and of course they look amazing. And so I just went for it. And a little camera tip, I had already cut that and the camera was off, the battery died, so I fake cut it again. Just go fast, nobody can tell. And now I'm doing something in the class. Steve promoted everybody to cut the knife completely in half, the handle, and then drill one side, then the other side. And it occurred to me, as long as everything was X, Y, and Z straight, I can just drill all the way through the whole handle from the reference points inside the steel, and then just split that chunk in half, and my knife holes will be on both sides, as opposed to drilling one side and then to the other side. So this is probably a little technique. I don't know if everybody else does it. I haven't seen anybody else do it. Not to say that it hasn't happened, but I think this is a technique that I will probably use from now on. Instead of fiddling with one side versus the other, and then that forward part of the scale, that curve, has to absolutely match both sides because I'm not going to be able to get at it again. And by drilling the hole through the solid cut, pre-cut piece, you can see that where the epoxy looks better inside. But by drilling through the solid pre-cut piece, I do myself justice by making sure that that forward part of the scale doesn't get misaligned. And now this is a step bit. I was trying my best to show that off, but it was really difficult to see it. Even when you're holding it in your hand, it's difficult to tell. But that's a little step bit that creates a shelf inside. You can see what's going on in there. Makes a little shelf so that when you do the nuggets, I don't know what they're called, the brass parts. Can somebody in the audience tell me what they're called? And I wanted to make sure the viewer understood what I was doing there, so that's why I showed all 4 holes slowly. I didn't speed it up because otherwise, I mean, you could hardly tell at normal speed what the hell's going on. But yeah, I just tried to show that there was a step in there. I tried to shoot down into the hole, but you couldn't see it anyway. And now it's time to epoxy that to the handle, and I just use regular 5-minute epoxy. And those little nuggets there, those brass screws, that little step edge lands on the shelf that I just created with the step drill bit, pulls everything together, and you leave enough hanging out so that you can sand off the slot. So that drops into that hole a little bit, and you got to be careful if you sand past the shoulder on that blade. The epoxy will probably work for a while, but in the past, what I've ever done is drill that hole and put in a snug fitting solid piece of brass, then hammer it over. So it's literally mushroomed on either side. And then when I sand it in, you don't really notice it. You don't notice the irregularity from the mushrooming. But I learned something new hanging out with Steve. And then you see me sanding off that nugget right there. That wasn't such a great camera angle. Sanding that nugget off and then working that little tiny roller wheel. This is a great setup from Ameribraid. They sent me this. So again, thank you to those guys for getting me totally set up. And if you want a grinder, I highly, highly, highly recommend Ameribraid. They're apparently a little less expensive than the more frequent brands you see out there. But they're a couple of guys made in America here, and they're doing a good job. And has a VFD. You could adjust the speed without losing the torque. That's my sales pitch. And just using a rat tail file to get in there. I didn't want to go too far too fast with that little roller wheel because you got to be careful using a belt grinder on the handle specifically, because you go too far too fast and then you have to make your other side look hokey like the way you accidentally made that one side if you're not paying attention. So I'm pretty well shaped now. I'm just sanding, trying to get rid of all like the facets from, I just spit on my finger to wipe that on to show you a little bit of what's showing up. And now I'm using CA glue. This threw everybody for a loop. Everyone's like, what the hell? But CA glue will soak into the surface and create like a little firm depth in there. It's like almost like a little fast drying penetrating epoxy. And off camera, I let this dry, and I did it 2 more times. That's what I didn't say. I sanded with 320 in between, wet sand with 320. And so now here we are after those 2 other applications with wet sand. And I put a little teak oil on there just to bring a little buff to the handle, just to give it that little shine. Now, whether this is going to hold up in a dishwasher or not, I probably won't try and figure that out. I just won't put it in the dishwasher. I'll just keep the knife clean. I have been using it for the last few days in my kitchen, cutting cheese and apples and whatever. And you see how thick my knife is. Again, Steve's knives would be much thinner than mine. But it has a nice weight to it, and I'm learning. I'm learning with every knife I make. And Steve had sharpened it on the stones, and it was razor sharp. But by me handling it a few times and playing with it about a week later when I finally finished the knife, I needed to take it out for a buff. So I brought it on the buffing wheel, and I got it back to a nice sharp. Before the buff, it wouldn't cut hair. With the buff, it cuts hair. So it's an old trick I learned. Using a buffing wheel gives you that nice fine sharp. And you can see the buffing wheel edge right in this shot, how it's a little bit shiny right at the edge. And yeah, this was a fun one, and I'm definitely hooked. I'm going to make more. Cutting an apple. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting me here on Patreon. See you soon.